Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yasmina Greco. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and I will be your host for today's online conference. As we get things started for our event today, we'd like to open the program by saying a very big thank you to Microsoft, our sponsor for today's webcast. And we'd like to let you know that Microsoft's Big Data solution enables organizations to unlock actionable insights from structured, unstructured, and streaming data. You can now deploy Hadoop with HD Insight service in the cloud with the simplicity and manageability of Windows Azure. Glean new insights from all your data with familiar tools such as Excel, SharePoint, using our HIVE, OBDC drivers and add-ins. Enrich your data by combining with the world's data through Windows Azure Marketplace. Learn more at www.microsoft.com/bigdata. Thank you again, Microsoft. Okay, folks, we have quite the lineup for you all today. And as we get things started, I'd like to go over a little housekeeping to help you get the most out of today's online conference. You'll want to open your group chat widget if you haven't already done so. This is where we can interact with each other during the event and where you can submit your questions for our speakers. If you do have questions for our speakers, please preface them with a capital letter Q so we know that it's for them and we can make sure they see it for Q&A. You can also open, move, and resize any of the other widgets. If you would like to tweet from the Twitter widget today, you may need to give it permission to access your account. It will automatically append the event's hashtag to your tweet so you don't have to. And folks, today our hashtag is StrataConf, all one word. If you should have any trouble during the event, please take a look at your help widget. If you continue to have problems, please post it in the group chat and one of our staff will help you right away. For choppy audio or stalled visuals, please try refreshing your window. And remember, the best thing you can do for a good audio stream is to close any apps that could interfere. People always ask, so we'd like you to know, we are recording today's online conference, and we'll have the archive ready usually within 48 hours. And folks, at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the program over to Alistair Croll for his welcome comments. Hi, Alistair.
Hi, Yasmina. Thank you very much. And welcome, everybody. There's lots of people online already, and the numbers still growing. We have a fascinating topic today, one I've been looking forward to doing for a while. The online conference series that we run as part of the sort of broader Strata practice area within O'Reilly looks at a bunch of different topics, and we've talked about how data can do good and affect charities and help the world. We've talked about data in specific vertical industries, and we have a number of other online conferences lined up this year. Basically, we run these things for free. We have a sponsor, in this case Microsoft, to give us a great deal of latitude to cover whatever topics we'd like. One of the things we noticed this year as we received the submissions for the call for papers for Strata Santa Clara, which happens at the end of February, is a spike in the number of proposals that had to do with using data to do bad things. And so I wanted to explore this with people, some of whom are speaking at Strata, but all of whom are experts in the field who've worked on issues around data and compliance, but also the sort of underhanded hackery that can happen around data. And we've got a fascinating lineup of people today to look at this from throughout the world. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what people come up with. And hopefully I can sort of set the stage with a few thoughts on data warfare, and then we can move ahead with our first speaker, Joseph Turian. So here are some opening thoughts on the topic of data warfare. And of course, as you're looking through these, if you have questions around this thread, please feel free to follow us on using the StrataConf hashtag. We're watching that. Or you can yell at me and tell me I'm stupid, because everyone else does, on Twitter at @Kroll. So to kick things off, when I was in university, we mercilessly taunted a friend of ours by signing him up for all manner of offers, from the sublime to the somewhat puerile. This peaked when we connected him to Nordic Track, which had an incredibly efficient direct marketing scheme, and it nearly resulted by the end of our third year in university in him having both a stationary skiing machine and an expensive adjustable bed topped with a space-age Tempur-Pedic mattress, none of which he ordered because that's how eager they were to get his business. Fortunately for him, he moved houses and he left no forwarding address once our time in school was over. So Craig, if you're out there, I apologize to you, but what we engaged in back then was a juvenile sort of cops and robbers equivalent of something that is being played out around us now and has now blossomed into full-blown war. We misused a bunch of information to inflict inconvenience that really bordered on suffering onto a friend of ours. Trust me, when you saw the stuff that was arriving in this guy's mailbox, you wouldn't believe that there was anybody that mean out there. Data warfare has been going on for a long, long time, and warfare in general has been going on for a long time. Whenever we invent a technology, be it fire or knives or guns or whatever, we always find ways to use that technology for bad, and people figure out how to abuse it, and then we set regulations and legislations. And eventually, as a society, we reach a sort of détente with that stuff. But there's a change this time because, frankly, the human race is busy colonizing a second online world and sticking prosthetic brains, which today we call smartphones, in front of our eyes and ears. If you missed it a couple of days ago, someone on TechCrunch found Sergey Brin, who looks here like he's about to go rob a bank, wearing a pair of his Google goggles on the subway, testing them out, probably looking at maps and so on. Everything that Sergey sees in this picture is reliant on a technology stack. And as we become increasingly dependent on those stacks to lead our lives in this sort of online world, we're becoming increasingly vulnerable. So some of this, people would argue, is not necessarily new. When we first created automatic phone switches at the low end of the stack, hackers quickly learned how to blow a Captain Crunch whistle to get free phone calls. And as we moved up the stack, consumers got modems, and attackers figured out how to rapidly redial them to get more than their fair share of time on a BBS, or to program scripts that could brute force their way into someone's accounts. And eventually we got better passwords, we fixed the payphones and the switches, and these problems went away, and we kind of reached this nice détente about that. We moved quickly up the networking stack. I don't know how many of you guys remember Trumpet Windsock above the physical and the link layers, but we tasted things like TCP/IP and found they worked really well, and we put this stuff on consumer machines with a kind of wild idealism, thinking that this web was going to be a new utopia. And then it turns out that because of how TCP works with the three-way handshake, hackers figured out how to DDoS people just by leaving a bunch of dangling connections. And that caused the arms race to escalate even further with router hardening and better heuristics for identifying floods of traffic. So with TCP stable, we moved up the stack some more into HTTP and SQL. And at first, these were open, innocent protocols. They gave us these huge advances in programming. And then, inevitably, attackers found a way to turn those machines into armies and put stuff into websites that would be interpreted by databases. And so every time we put one of these technologies out there, we saw something good and something bad come out of it. MP3s gave us this explosion in new music and new business models and crowdsourced audiobooks and so on, even as they leveled an existing music industry and built a new one, finding new forms of piracy for which we hadn't even invented names. So this is a friend of mine, Paul Makapetros. He was the editor of a book I wrote years ago. Really smart guy. He is one of the creators of today's internet. Along with people like Vint Cerf and John Postel, he built the web. And he one of his biggest contributions was to create DNS and implement the first version of the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, or SMTP, technologies that we've all relied on 50 times before we even get out of bed just by looking at our smartphone. He's also single-handedly responsible for all the spam in the world. And this is something I tend to bug him about, and he sort of takes with a good-natured ribbing. But there's a negative truth to it. DNS, the domain name service, was a simplified version of more robust directories like those in X25. But Paul didn't need all the overhead of that stuff because he was just trying to solve a problem of not being able to keep a list of all the IP addresses on a pad by the side of his desk. He also created the SMTP protocol for sending mails, which was, as the name implies, a whittled-down version of MTP, the mail transfer protocol. And so, of course, SMTP took out a bunch of the things that people didn't think they'd need. And so neither DNS nor SMTP included end-to-end authentication. These two things, the fact that you can send mail and you can look up an address in an unauthenticated manner, make spam possible. If either of those things had some kind of good end-to-end authentication, spam would be really hard to do. And we've come up with lots of attempts to try and fix this, but we keep ignoring them because we live with this glut of spam because of the tremendous value of email. email has an important lesson to teach us about how technologies get accepted and adopted. We owe so much to its openness and to its simplicity because of how people like Paul built protocols like DNS and SMTP, that there's really no need to go through a complex bureaucracy. You can just fire up a website without a lot of overhead, and you can make good things happen. The Internet has flourished precisely because it was built on this foundation of loose consensus and working code. But it's also flourished in spite of that. I mean, Paul didn't have any idea back when he was building the Internet with his friends that these protocols would be used for things like video, all the way up the stack, PPP and Ethernet and TCP and HTTP and so on. We divide the networking protocols into discrete layers. And that's done for a very good reason. I can replace, for example, token ring with Ethernet, or I can replace UDP with TCP, or I can replace Flash with DHTML, independent of the other layers. I don't need to ask someone's permission to build a new application. And so Paul and the other framers of the web didn't know we'd use the web in these clever, interesting ways, but they left it open so that we could. What's fascinating about big data, and why I think this is worth a new discussion instead of just sitting around and lamenting the fact that people do bad things on the Internet, is that by leaving the Internet open as much as they could, they've made a lot of these stacks vulnerable. And where once upon a time someone would get a free phone call or they'd be able to own a server, the implications are much bigger today because of how much we rely on things. Now, geeks often talk about layer 8 problems. You've probably heard the expression, it's a layer 8 problem, or the problem lies between the keyboard and the monitor. Humans tend to be this user-level problem, and unfortunately big data is interesting precisely because it is the layer 8 protocol. It's where humanity's rubber meets technology's road, and it's got great power, but it demands great responsibility, and it threatens a great deal of risk unless we do it right. And just like other technologies that we invented that got bad and then got good and then bad and then eventually became stable, that'll happen here. Other layers of the stack have been hacked, and so I'm using the term data warfare sort of hyperbolically to talk about a set of things, but let me give you a couple of concrete examples. So first, let's talk about analytics. Analytics applications, like in this case Google Analytics, rely on tags embedded in URLs to understand the nature of the traffic they receive. If you go to a URL like solvefororinteresting.com, but you leave a campaign tag at the end of it, my analytics system will pick up that the campaign that you came into was, for example, campaign equals data war, and then I would have a campaign that showed up in my list of campaigns. You can see this here. This is a concrete example. This is some analytics from Solve for Interesting, and you can see one of the campaigns is called Narayanan Loves This. That's because some guy named Narayanan has a domain shortener, and that's the campaign tag it puts into the link every time someone follows it. And so basically he's injecting his name into my list of campaigns. I didn't set up a campaign called Narayanan Loves This. He just decided that he would make his URL shortener include that URL, and it's showing up in my data feed. Now that seems pretty innocent, but what if he changed his name to Facebook? I got no control over that, and all of a sudden I think Facebook is generating a ton of traffic towards me. So he's misinforming my system by capitalizing on that. And this gets back to the openness of the Internet, because this kind of vulnerability exists everywhere. You've probably heard of Google bombs, right? Google has since cleaned up how this looks, but once upon a time, if you did a Google search for find Chuck Norris, you get this page that says Google word search for Chuck Norris, because you don't find Chuck Norris, he finds you. And this is actually a website supposed to look like a Google landing page. But the idea here is that the way you create a Google bomb is you're polluting Google's algorithm for understanding what's relevant, tricking it into thinking that the most relevant thing in the world for this page, for the text about Chuck Norris is this page. In fact, there's another example of this with the White House where someone, a bunch of people decided that the words miserable failure should point to the biography of George W. Bush, and they Google bombed that stuff because of the openness of that protocol. The openness of Google's PageRank algorithm is what makes it possible to gather all this information from the web. It's also what makes us vulnerable. And so there's this two-sided coin that we're constantly facing. If you run a blog, you'll probably see a bunch of comment spam that appears with nonsense in it. And that nonsense is essentially an arms race between spammers trying to inject words into an algorithm and convince an algorithm that they're legit. But if I send you a mail with the word Viagra in it, there's probably a spam filter that goes, well, the word Viagra is likely associated with spam, so I'll make it more likely that I'm going to flag this particular post. if I send you spam that has a bunch of other words, I can teach you that a whole bunch of other words are actually spammy, and I can mistrain the machine learning algorithm. So when you see a post like this, you're actually watching a round in a fight between spammers and blockers, played out comment by comment on millions of websites around the world. Now, spam is obviously a good example of this stuff, and those kinds of anti-spam heuristics happen behind the scenes, and they do work pretty well. But despite this, some spam gets through, and when it does, we seldom click on it because it's easy to spot. It's poorly worded, it comes from an unfamiliar source, it doesn't render properly in our email client. So we've been pretty good at picking out spam, say, hello, I am Nigerian royalty, and yes, in fact, this man is Nigerian royalty for real. The reality is that it's possible to target someone well and spam and phish them if you're willing to invest time researching the targets and dumpster diving and finding out more about them. We've seen cases of several nation-state level viruses aimed at governments or rich targets that show a concerted, handcrafted phishing attack can work, but it takes a lot of work to do so, or at least it did until recently. In the hands of an attacker, tools like Facebook's graph search, for example, or a site like PQ, which shows you everything you wanted to know about me in 2 clicks, are really good to target an attack and do a good phishing attack. The reason spam is still easy to spot is that it's traditionally been hard to automate this kind of work. People don't dig through your trash unless you're under investigation. And so when you receive an email that looks somewhat skeptical, what that email looks like is often, it often has telltale signs where the typos aren't quite good, or the text is not as clear, and there's unusual carriage returns and so on. Consumers have access to big data tools that spy agencies could once only dream of, things like PQ and things like Facebook graph search. So the effectiveness of phishing and identity theft and other information crimes will soar once bad actors learn how to harness these tools. Digging through virtual trash and data exhaust is what machines do best, and big data lets personal attacks work at scale. If smart data scientists with decent grammar decided to try and maximize spam effectiveness, we'd lose pretty quickly. They're really, really good at figuring out what works for us. If instead of figuring out how to make us click on ads, they made us think about how to click on spam, we'd probably fail miserably because to them, phishing is just another optimization problem. Now that's a pretty bold example of an obvious attack, but let's talk about a more subtle one. Data warfare doesn't have to be as obvious as injecting falsehoods or mistraining machine learning algorithms or leveraging abundant personal data to trick people. It can be far more subtle. Let's say, for example, you wanted to polarize a political discussion such as gun control in order to reduce the reasoned discourse of compromise and justify your hard-line stance. All you need to do is get angry. There was a recent study that showed that the tone of comments in a blog post had a tangible impact on how readers responded to that post. When comments used reasonable language, readers' views are more moderate. When those comments were aggressive, readers hardened their positions. Those that agreed with the post did so more strongly, and those that disagreed objected more fiercely. The chance for compromise simply went away. There are similar approaches you can take for sentiment analysis, things that try to gauge public opinion, and data becomes a reality. There's a lot of other things you can do. This is a case of a programmer who created an algorithm to make books by scouring reference material, and he injected 800,000 books into Amazon's catalog because the friction of making a book went away. Now that's obviously a data problem for someone like Amazon, but it's an example of the kinds of things we're going to deal with. So the reality is that data warfare is real. In some cases like spam, it's been around for decades. In other cases, like tampering with a competitor's data through analytics, it's been possible but too expensive until cloud computing and new algorithms made it easy and cheap. And in many instances, it's possible precisely because our growing dependence on information is making us vulnerable to anything that corrupts how we lead our daily lives. And just as the inexorable cycle of good and bad and stable happened at every layer, so I think it will happen with big data. But unlike attacks on lower levels of the stack, this time it won't just be spam in an inbox. It'll be our online and offline lives. Attackers can corrupt that information. They can blind an algorithm. They can inject some falsehood, and they can do so with far-reaching consequences. They can change outcomes in subtle ways, undermine a competitor, flip an election. All of this happens because, frankly, big data is people. And attacks on data become attacks on people, on our political livelihood and so on. So I think this is a really fascinating topic because attacks on data fundamentally transform what we can do, how we can lead our lives. And there are tremendous vulnerabilities that have been created in the interest of openness and rapid growth, and we're going to see, I think, a move in the coming years to shore that up and provide authenticity and veracity. Because this armistice around big data warfare is many years away, and I think we're going to see a lot of catastrophic and very visible examples of people swaying elections or bringing down competitors or basically fudging the numbers in subtle, optimized, data science-driven ways. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about to frame the issue. We have a number of great speakers ahead of us, and the first one is someone who never ceases to amaze me with every time I've met him, he's always got an interesting idea I hadn't thought of. He brings a certain charisma and comedy to some rather dark and complex fields sometimes. So I'm going to hand things over to Joseph to talk about black hat data science. Joseph.
Great. Thank you for that, Alistair. I appreciate that. So in my talk, I'm going to be sort of motivating from a different perspective what I'm calling black hat data science. And I'm also going to be delving a little bit more deeply into some of the attack vectors that Alistair was talking about. This is sort of part of an ongoing area of study of mine that I've been calling sort of jokingly psi versus psi. Just to give you a little background on myself, I've been an engineer for about 20 years, and I've been doing data science. I guess that's what the kids call it nowadays, but we used to call it machine learning, natural language processing. I've been doing that for about 10 years. And also, I consult on these ideas through the meta-optimized consultancy, which some people have heard of, some people haven't. I'm going to be talking, I guess, quite quickly and not really getting to go into as much depth as I'd like for all of these ideas, but I do encourage you in your chat window, if there's something that you'd like me to dig into a little more, just put the question up, and then we can do it during the question phase. So data science is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good, and it can be used for evil. These are evil people. And when evil people apply a certain level of finesse and technique to their work, we call them black hats. So black hat is sort of I guess a tradition in the security world as well as in the world of internet marketing. And black hat techniques and approaches are discussed quite openly. Black Hat World is a forum where you can learn about black hat internet marketing. DEF CON and Black Hat are security conferences where people talk about black hat techniques quite openly. But we don't really have these discussions in data science. You wouldn't see a top researcher come out and say, here's a black hat attack. This is not a very commonplace. And I'd like to hypothesize about why this is. I don't feel too strongly about this argument, but I would argue that data science, at least historically, has come out of academia, out of the ivory tower, out of the quintessential white hat institution. Whereas if you look at the sort of growth of skill set in internet marketing or security, people who do internet marketing, people who do security, they're generally self-taught as opposed to coming out of academia and then sort of applying their techniques in the world. So that would be my argument as to why we don't really have black hat data scientists yet. I mean, it's possible that there are a few top data scientists behind the scenes who are black hats, but they definitely don't have the same sort of presence as they do in the security or internet marketing community, where it's very clear that there are these bad actors. Now, what we do have, on the other hand, I would argue, are gray hats. I would argue that most industry practitioners of data scientists are, in fact, gray hats. For example, if you are working on advertising, and you prioritize advertiser needs over consumer privacy, then you're a gray hat. Now, it's worth pointing out that there's this entire spectrum of gray hat activity. It's not just that everything is purely black and white, pun intended. So even if you look at, say, the SEO community, where lines are sort of people try and strictly draw lines between black hat and white hat SEO, there have been some highly publicized incidents in which companies that have touted their white hat SEO, it's been exposed that, yeah, actually they've been using some gray and some black techniques as part of it. And, if you were to, say, go a little darker on the spectrum, there are some companies that use data science that part of their core strategy is data science, and it's a dark gray hat data science approach. So my second take-home point is that most industry data scientists are practicing some sort of gray hat activity. Okay, so as a side note, what is the sexiest job of the 21st century? Well, DJ Patil, he was a former chief of data at LinkedIn. He wrote a well-publicized article in the Harvard Business Review, and he argued that a data scientist is the most sexy job in the 21st century. He also went on, without, I guess, much irony, to point out that in the 1980s, the most sexy job was being a quant. A quant who now is universally reviled, almost universally reviled. Now, the question I'd like to pose is, if you're an evil genius and it's the 21st century, what job would you take? Well, my argument would be, if you're an evil genius in the 21st century and you're Gordon Gekko, you'll probably want to aspire to be a data scientist. Now, I'm not really trying to make a black and white argument that finance is bad or data science is sexy. What I am trying to say is that if our predictions are correct, that if the big data market is going to become increasingly lucrative, then in this case, we will attract more unscrupulous actors, because unscrupulous actors will be drawn to any large market that they could exploit for profit and gain. So my third take-home point is, if we don't have black hat data scientists yet, if we don't have skilled top data scientists who are practicing black hat, we will soon, because the money is there, and it will be there. Hi. So I'd like to do a thought experiment. This thought experiment, this is something actually I do a lot in my practice, and I found out that Hillary Mason does the same thing. When she looks at a new research question, she asks 3 questions. 1, how do we know if we've won? And 2, what are the first things we'll build with it? 3, most germane to this talk, what's the most evil thing that can be done with this? And of course, she only asks this purely as a creative tool. She's not trying to encourage evil, right? Hillary Mason, we know, or we hope, is a good data scientist. But the thought experiment that I'm trying to pose is, what if these top data scientists went to evil? Or, for that matter, let's talk about Google for a minute, right? Maybe I'm naive, but I tend to think of Google as a white hat company, or perhaps a light gray company. I definitely wouldn't put them on the darker end of the spectrum. But let's say we were to take Google and turn it on its head. We were to imagine an organization, a well-funded organization, that decided to be strategically evil, and then was to load up on top data scientists. So what would they do? What would this company work on? What would its attack vectors be? So big data has a variety of applications. There's military applications, political applications, financial applications, medical applications, etc., etc. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus not on military or political applications of data science, though there are naturally black hat applications. I'm going to focus on data science for financial gain and data science for monetary gain. So here's one approach. One approach that you could do if you're a black hat data scientist, take a lucrative black hat internet marketing technique, a black hat marketing technique that has a proven business model. Then use data science to scale this technique, and also use data science to scale this technique in a manner that you are undetected. In this case, you can take the business model and then profit at scale. So let's dig into this a little more. There are two key patterns that you're going to use as a black hat data scientist. The first, which is pretty obvious, is stealing other people's data. The second one, and this sort of touches on something Alistair mentioned earlier, is influence manipulation. And I think influence manipulation is the really potent pattern here. So I'm going to dig into it a bit more. One technique for manipulating influence, and also just for scaling what you're doing, is to use bots that are human-like, bots that it's difficult to detect that it was programmatically generated. Another technique is to leapfrog off of cheap human labor. You can, for example, build your data science on Mechanical Turk, and as such, you can build black hat data science on top of Mechanical Turk. To dig a little more into influence manipulation, I've given some examples of ways that people manipulate influence, and these are all really different sides of the same coin. Sites like on sites where influence is driven by voting, such as Hacker News or Reddit or Dig. I'm sorry, that would be a voting ring. When influence is driven by voting, a voting ring and creating sock puppet accounts is a good way to drive up your influence in a manipulative way. Sock puppets can also be used to advance your viewpoints and tear down the viewpoints of others. Sybil attacks, it's another form of influence manipulation that comes out of the peer-to-peer literature when reputation requires some sort of consensus, or influence requires some sort of consensus. If you create many pseudonymous accounts and then you use them to manipulate a peer-to-peer network, that's a Sybil attack. And this is an open research question of how we defend against people who create many false identities. It's also Tim Huang. He had this interesting research project. I quote the title of his talk on the bottom of my slide. I'm not a real friend, but I play one on the internet. Tim Huang of Pack Social. He actually came up with a influence manipulation technique on social media, where he could actually create social chatbots that no one could detect, social chatbots that could pass the Turing test. And how he did this was he actually did sort of a man-in-the-middle attack, where he would actually relay messages between different people and then inject the messages that he wanted into the conversations that he was creating. Another attack vector that you might consider using, if you were to drive fake traffic to a fake website and generate fake ad click-throughs, you've just committed ad fraud. Now, a lot of ad companies publicly will say that ad fraud is easy to detect. But on the other hand, in private discussions with data scientists working behind the scenes at ad companies, we've sort of sat around over beers and discussed how we might actually commit ad fraud and how would you do this correctly. And the general consensus seems to be that if you were to try and commit ad fraud with a certain level of expertise, you might be able to do it on a large scale in an undetected manner. So let's talk about spam. Alistair was talking about spam earlier, and SEO search engine optimization. It's one of the main applications of spam. But spam actually has a lot of different applications trying for chatbots trying to convert people, say, to your dating website, et cetera, et cetera. So using new language models in natural language processing, I believe it would be possible to generate very good spam. And we haven't seen this yet, or maybe we have, but we just don't even know that we've seen it yet. So astroturfing historically means concealing your identity or advancing a false identity in order to create a political or advertising message without knowing who the person that actually is creating the message, right? You create an independent third party who supports your political campaign or supports what your product is that you're selling. So another attack and this sort of touches on what I've discussed earlier, is if you're to astroturf, which is a form of spam, and you do it on social media, you can manipulate reputations of companies, of brands, etc. And lastly, there's just good old stock price manipulation, pump and dump. This would be sort of another application of influence manipulation. So I'm going to say, as sort of a take-home point, there are these lucrative attack vectors that are available to black hat data scientists. So I'm running out of time. I do encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, drop a question into the chat box. Also, perhaps come see my longer talk on this topic at Strata. At the longer talk, I'm actually going to sort of do some nuts and bolts and actually dig into how these attacks might work. And I'm also going to walk through the defenses that exist against these attacks. For some of the attacks, there are pretty solid defenses, and for some of them, they're not. We don't really have good defenses yet. So I'd like to. This is my summary of the 5 points. I'd like to end on a comment. Jeff Hammerbacher pretty famously said, "The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads." And to that, I would respond, well, at least they're only gray hats. Well, that's my talk. I don't know if there's a few minutes for questions, maybe?
Yeah, you have time for a couple of questions if you've got them, Joseph. But and looking at the Q&A, we do have a couple in there. Okay. So we got one question from Yasmina, passed on from one of the audience's members, Alberto, wondering if he knows of applications used to spawn many sock puppets to shape opinions of corporations. So obviously you're not going to provide him with the name and contact information of companies that make such things, but maybe you can go into a little more detail about how sock puppets work and some of the data science approaches that make them harder to detect.
Sure. So in terms of creating sock puppets to manipulate influence, the general pattern is you figure out exactly what forum you want to actually manipulate influence, whether that would be on Twitter or Hacker News or it wouldn't really be Hacker News for large-scale brand manipulation, but Twitter, it might be a specialist forum on, say, car motors. And the second thing is you need to create accounts in an undetected manner. People generally use proxies to do this. Then you want to have, say, one sock puppet account associated with each of your proxy IPs. And then the last thing is that you need to generate content so that they seem like real people. So it's not commonplace that people have very good spam generators to generate good content on a large scale, but it is relatively easy to hire a workforce of cheap labor, whether it's on Amazon Mechanical Turk or Odesk. So a typical technique might be that you use the cheap labor to just sort of generate low-value messages that just create confidence that the person is a real person. And then when it comes time to make a high-value message, whether it's to inject commentary or respond to something, that actual action gets triaged to a higher level worker or the person actually running the attack or a trusted associate. I hope that answers your question.
Sure, and like you said, Joseph, you're going to be talking about this more at Strata, so thank you for spending some time with us today. I know you have to run, but really appreciate you making the effort to get in here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Up next, our following speaker is going to be talking about similar things, and she's going to be looking at hacking cybersecurity. Christina Gagné leads the intellectual property, internet, and technology practice at Gagné Margosian, which I almost mispronounced, and is working on a book about hacker rights, as well as a book about California politics, as well as working on California politics. So two topics that have come under increasing scrutiny with things like the mysterious growth and vanishing of Romney followers before and after the recent election, for example. So Christina is going to talk to us about hacking cybersecurity. Christina.
Great, thank you. Well, my perspective on cybersecurity and on hacking comes from the legal perspective. So as Alistair has said, I manage our intellectual property, internet, and technology practice. And as a lawyer, it's an ominous task to be working in an area of the law where there are very few rules, and in fact, where everything is driven by social norms. And as I started to practice privacy law and cybersecurity, which are two things that I specifically focus on, nerd law, as my firm likes to call it, we started to notice that social norms and what's happening culturally really shape this area of the law. And in some respects, that can be very positive, but in others, it can be negative because technology tends to run so far ahead of the law. And as law, and this is not just in the United States, but internationally as well, tries to catch up, you have members of Congress, you have federal agencies, you have people that might not understand the technology or understand the differences between the use of technology, trying to quickly legislate, trying to quickly come up with solutions to problems. And when it comes to hacking and when it comes to cybersecurity, these solutions are very reactionary. And the reason that I find that scary as a lawyer is that we tend to view the law as sacrosanct, as something that has been well thought out and deliberated. We have a variety of laws, especially international law when it comes to an area like warfare, that has been well deliberated and has 50 to 60 years of international debate about how you would treat an enemy combatant or what human rights law, for example, should include. What we don't have, and this is something that is an international problem, but I'm going to use the U.S. as a point of focus, is a law to deal with hackers. What do we do when systems are compromised? And more particularly, what do we do with people who have compromised systems? And I think that this is a good follow-up at the last two talks that we've had. So I've titled this Sex, Drugs, Rock, and Code because there is this perception, and I think that pop culture has really glommed onto this, that what is happening is kind of irresponsible, that people are just doing things and technology is changing, and as instances of hacking and data breach and compromised systems get played out in the media, it sort of creates a panic, it creates a scare. And so you have people then responding to what's happening, whether it's major news publications or it's the Hollywood or whoever else creating films and creating media around this topic. It really just creates this storm, and that storm ends up in legislative solutions. And that can be very negative because that means that we're not actually understanding the technology or understanding the differences and what types of hacking occurs and what types of data breaches are happening, because some of it's very innocuous and some of it's malicious. So I'm kind of brought back to code and what is code. And as a lawyer, code for me is a collection of laws. Or code for me is regulations and procedures that follow that are created by agencies after laws are passed in Congress, for example. But as anyone who is familiar with Lawrence Lessig and his book Code, code is architecture. It's what we deal with when we go online. And the architecture of the Internet has really been what has shaped how we use the Internet, what the ethics of using the Internet are, what the social norms of Internet use are, outside of having something actually codified in the law. And what I'm going to focus on today is one, hackers, a term that's very ill-defined. and how cybersecurity law affects those who engage in such activities. But more importantly, what's happening right now in the U.S. that perhaps internationally we should take pause and kind of look at how this is playing out in dealing with cybersecurity. So what is hacking? And a lot of times when I'm dealing with companies that I work with, they're always in crisis when a system gets compromised, even if somebody has just hacked into their website and changed a couple words, or there might be a minor data breach. They're very concerned about this problem, and they immediately want to take the most harsh approach in terms of dealing with it. But we really have to look at what hacking is, and this conversation is about data warfare, so perhaps some more nefarious acts that happen in terms of hacking. But sometimes it's just a joke, or sometimes it's a political statement, and so you have free speech implications involved. And in working with corporations as well as legislators, they tend to refer back to pop culture, or they tend to refer back to what's happening in the media. So there's a perception that hacking might be war games, the probably not so popular 80s movie that sort of depicted hacking. And this is what I feel a lot of people that don't understand technology, non-technologists, think about when they think of hacking. Or they think of a movie like Weird Science, where someone's doing something sort of, revolutionary and sort of funny when it comes to, computer use and creating programs. But this is the impression that the layperson has when it comes to data warfare, when it comes to hacking, is that they have these impressions that might have come from 20 to 25 years ago in pop culture, and then they, go online in the morning and realize that their credit card has been hacked into, or that, for example, a large university system, all the email accounts have been compromised, and people start to panic. So a few things that I know that are being dealt with here in the U.S. is, one, what are the appropriate responses? So there's innocuous hacking, which could include, for example, the FBI website has been hacked. It could be seen as a joke. And then there's more malicious activities that have occurred in terms of, is somebody hacking our national security infrastructure and sharing information? So we're looking at things that are probably more civil disputes, like a company going after somebody that has hacked their systems, versus the United States and their own systems being compromised and what the appropriate response should be. What I'm focusing on is the rights of those who compromise. And this is not a very popular topic because, the last couple of years we've had several instances of what many may consider to be malicious hacking attempts. But what are the rights of people that engage in these activities? And I think that more importantly, the conversation has been renewed in the last week and a half, unfortunately, due to the death of Internet activist Aaron Swartz. What are the rights of people that engage in these activities? And I will spend a large part of this presentation discussing that and what should happen next. And finally, rushing to solve a problem that is intangible and tangible. This problem is intangible in the sense that the people who are regulating it really have no idea how it works. Even if they have technologists called into hearings and they hear about instances and they learn about the technology, they don't really know how it works. And they're trying to make decisions based off of a limited amount of information. But it's also a tangible problem. I mean, while some hacking is certainly not malicious, we're dealing with financial breaches, we're dealing with national security breaches, we're dealing with issues that have large implications. And these are things that, sort of catch the attention of legislators, and they have to very quickly decide how they're going to appropriately respond to them. So, innocuous hacking. One of my favorite instances that I've read about is how 50 Berkeley High School students hacked into attendance records. And although this is a joke, the way the school responded is the way that I feel government is responding right now when it comes to these types of attempts, which is they're taking a harsh response. So instead of perhaps educating the students about why that was a bad idea or taking a response that would perhaps be more rehabilitative for the students, it was suspension and expulsion. And while that might be a benign example of a consequence of compromising a system, the U.S. is taking that approach but exacting criminal penalties, and that's where things get very scary. This conversation was particularly renewed in 2010 around WikiLeaks. And the way the government responded was to create a panic. It was to immediately put it into a national security context and put it in a context where criminal penalties were being discussed. And by framing the conversation that way, everything that has happened since has had that same element, that whether it's a civil case and the Department of Justice is prosecuting, whether it's a criminal case, the harshest penalties are sought and then the harshest penalties are exacted. And this is scary because if you're going to prosecute instances of hacking, if you're going to prosecute instances of systems being compromised, you have to have an understanding of when the instance is non-controversial, when there weren't that many consequences, or when perhaps maybe it was a national security breach, or maybe a company's finances were indeed very much compromised. But this is how the government really associates hacking. They associate it with an instance like this, and because this is probably one of the better known instances where this has happened, it's had a lot of effects. Well, there's also instances of economic consequences when it comes to hacking. And there was a recent case, and Wired cover it, where the court found that code's not physical property, yet people are being prosecuted under legislation such as the Economic Espionage Act. And so hackers who are hacking major financial institutions and moving funds around, whether it's for their personal gain or just sort of to have fun with these large companies who many have a lot of disagreements with in the last couple of years. These issues remain to be sort of unknown. So should we be using these types of laws to prosecute these types of instances, or should a new corpus of laws be created? So where are we at? And you would think that after the Internet's existence has been around for so long, we would have at least somewhat of a corpus of law to deal with these issues. But in fact, our cybersecurity legislation and our cybersecurity frameworks are very paltry. So we have a few pieces of legislation here in the U.S. That have been most important in terms of dealing with instances of systems being compromised. First and foremost is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. This has recently, in the last week and a half, gotten much more attention because it was the federal law under which Aaron Swartz was being prosecuted. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is very broad. So, for example, there are employers that bring actions against employees who run off with company computers. It can be applied to anyone who is seen to have compromised a system within an organization or against the government. Or more importantly, it can be that you're at a university and you use a mechanism to access a system that's already publicly accessible, but it's not the normal route of doing it. And that comes back to the idea of unauthorized access to systems and what that means. The second law that's used now, and this usually applies when the hacking has a financial consequence, so for example, a bank or financial institution having their systems compromised, is the Economic Espionage Act. This has been very popular in the last couple of years in its use because it does have a long history of being litigated, just not in the technology sense. And so this is the other place where legislators often look in terms of what the next step should be in terms of legislating in this area. And finally, we have this patchwork in the United States of state-level regulation. So sometimes this falls under consumer affairs. And so it really depends at the state level whether the Attorney General's office in a particular state finds this to be a priority. And if they find it to be a priority, you then are dealing with a different set of laws on a state-by-state basis and having no idea what the legal penalties might be for the activity that you're undertaking. But where we're sort of left is with this idea, or with this idea in the U.S. particularly, that all of this has national security implications. And where the conversation has stopped around cybersecurity has been, well, the United States government has to have access to information about data and how it's being used in different companies. And if they have access to this data, and if companies are forced to share this information, they'll be able to proactively spot cybersecurity issues and proactively deal with them versus this reactive approach that has been in place for the last 25 years or so. And when you take this framing of everything being a national security issue and the government needing to be involved, whether it's a public or private sector problem, we end up in a place where we are prosecuting in a criminal context versus dealing with things in a civil environment where there's less harsh penalties. And that brings me to the regulatory attempts that have been happening in the U.S. Over the last year or so. So the White House has advanced its own cybersecurity proposal. It really showed no sense of urgency that there was an issue and kind of failed to take a stance, one, either proactively to protect companies and systems that are being compromised, or two, protecting the people that might engage in these activities. And this is where the conversation about requiring companies to disclose that they are hacked or what user and customer data might have been compromised led to other less popular legislative and federal attempts to deal with the problem. Probably most popularly in the last year were SOPA here in the U.S. and then CISPA. So CISPA, which was the Cyber Intelligence Sharing Protection Act, was a piece of legislation that would have led to companies having to share data, one, amongst each other, and two, with the government about people that they potentially thought would be threats. And there was a lot of conversation over this piece of legislation, which eventually ended up getting tossed. But sort of at the crux of this debate was that the government needs more information. They need more data. And that leads to a conversation of what are they going to do with this information and how are they viewing threats. And because we don't have anything outlined of what is or isn't a threat against the government when it comes to cybersecurity, or in fact, what is a threat when the action is taken against a private company and there might be implications for government, we don't have anything on the books that tells us how to deal with this appropriately. And so while CISPA may have died, the idea that we have to use companies and use information systems to get information to identify threats and then go after people is very scary when there's no civil rights in place to protect people that are engaging in this activity. And that leads me to the topic of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and revisiting the idea of prosecutorial discretion. So in the U.S., especially when it comes to federal laws, prosecutors in the Department of Justice have a lot of discretion as to how they're going to prosecute things. And so going back to the spectrum of innocuous versus malicious hacking activities, it's really lawyers who are making decisions about what instances should be prosecuted and what instances shouldn't be prosecuted. And most specifically, and my slides are advancing in front of me, but most specifically, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, really innocuous hacking activities, for example, let's say somebody hacks a CIA website and changes a couple words. If a zealous prosecutor in the U.S. wants to prosecute somebody under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, they can go ahead and do that. Even though it might not seem like it was a big deal, they can go after the harshest penalties. In the same stroke, a prosecutor could be dealing with a major compromise of a corporation or an institution and go after somebody with the same zeal that they would have gone after someone who was engaging in that innocuous activity. And so the fact that the law is so broad and the fact that the Department of Justice does have so much latitude are just things to think about. And this is an international problem. It's not something that's just dealt here with the U.S. Many of the laws that are being shaped in Europe around cybersecurity and how to appropriately punish those who engage in nefarious activities are having the same conversation. It's looking outward as to what's happening in pop culture, looking to how the public's reacting to it, and then wanting to make sure that they're creating a response that the public will indeed be happy with. So code and cultural influence is very important, and it sometimes is misunderstood how culture really does shape this area of the law. Privacy law in the United States, for example, is all culturally shaped, and so what currently exists and what protections are in place are from 20 to 30 years of history and case law that brought us to where the law is today. But courts, because they're not technologists, have to look public. And so when they look and see people openly sharing data and using social networks in such an open and robust way, their impression of how important data is that, well, people individually don't care. But then when it comes to systems being compromised or financial systems or email accounts being compromised, or I think a popular example would be the Sony PlayStation compromising that took place about a year and a half ago. Legislators and judges then have to say, well, somebody thought they were engaging in what was an innocuous system, and all of a sudden their information has been exposed. So we need to make sure that we have penalties in place to deal with that. And then you come back to popular icons within the technology industry and the impression that legislators have of them and their companies. And while there has been a lot of debate of how to regulate these types of companies in the privacy space, there has been a lot less debate about having these companies work with them in the cybersecurity space. And some of the major companies that were under discussion when it came to legislation such as the Secure IT Act and then CISPA were companies like Google, like Facebook, and Apple, how the government could work with these companies to exact the information that they're usually criticizing them for collecting in the first place. And so there really is this tension between privacy and cybersecurity and how they play together. But coming back to this definition of code, it is an interactive system. And so we can't just rely on code as in the system of laws to protect people, and we can't just rely on the code of the Internet, the architecture of the Internet, to protect people and systems either. And so really I think it's us focusing as a community, lawyers, technologists, and others, to make sure the law arrives at a place that's comfortable for both those interacting within it and trying to make political statements, when they compromise systems, and also protecting those that even if they are engaging in criminal activities, we do have a robust system of rights in place for people that engage in criminal activities, even when they're things that society doesn't agree with. So that's it for me, and thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really fascinating and very timely given some of the things going on with Aaron Swartz. And actually up here in my native Montreal, there's a big crisis about a student who hacked into a system and warned the college of it and was expelled. And the people whose system he hacked actually offered him a job. So definitely timely and controversial. We have a whole bunch of questions for you. I'm going to ask you a couple of them quickly, and then hopefully you can answer the rest offline. We'll make sure you get access to them. They're in the Q&A tab. Russell Thomas wanted to know, what is the clock speed for cyber legislation and regulation, compared to the clock speed at which a black hat ecosystem operates? And I guess this pertains to both what you and what Joseph was saying earlier. How fast do you find legislation catches up with this stuff?
Well, in the area of cybersecurity, we're seeing a several-year lag, and so some of the responses are responding to things that happened 2 or 3 years ago. But as I said, legislation can be very reactionary. I mean, CISPA was very reactionary to a series of data breaches that took place in 2010 and 2011. Generally, in the area of technology, and I'll use copyright as an example, even though it's not directly related, the law has been running about 10 to 15 years behind. And so, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the copyright space in the U.S., was passed in '98. They kind of tried to look ahead, quickly come up with a legislative solution, and then hope that it worked. Well, it's 12 years later, and it's still not working. So we're basically dealing with a pretty long lag in terms of legislating things, or the problem that we try to prospectively legislate on issues and we don't fully understand them. And I say we because it's usually lawyers and legislators. So I think that in this particular instance, it would probably be good to take pause and think about what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, work with data scientists, work with people who are actually technologists in this space, and then come up with appropriate solutions that will create consistent frameworks.
Got it. Good answer. So do hackers' rights depend on their intent? You talked about the difference between sort of a prank and something serious.
So the main piece of legislation that's used right now, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, intent is not a factor. And so really the focus is on authorized access. So let's say you are doing something as a prank and you still had an authorized access to a system. It's going to be treated the same as if you hacked into a bank system and shared everybody's credit card and account information or moved funds around. So the problem is that basically when a case is brought or there's a complaint made, lawyers are essentially making decisions at the Department of Justice, of how they should go after things. And so because there is this spectrum of innocuous versus malicious, in practice, there needs to be that same spectrum embedded in the law. And actually the response to, after what happened to Aaron Swartz has been, if that had been in the law in the first place, then perhaps that situation might not have happened. So I think that as that law is seeking to be revised currently, we will see that spectrum embedded in the law.
All right, and I'm going to have to ask this question just because it came up on TechCrunch today. It seems like it's the week or two of hackers here. Andrew Auernheimer hacked into a system using an open API. The word hacked in that sentence is entirely of my making because it was an API and you could increment the number, and then it showed you the iPad 3G user's email address, and as a result you could harvest all of the email addresses available. That's a breach of a system. It's not being used in the way it was intended, but it didn't really constitute unauthorized access since the API was there to allow you to get someone's email address given their number. Can you talk about that? Surely intent enters into that particular discussion.
Yeah, so there's a Forbes article about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and what's been happening over the last 2 weeks. And Marcia Hoffman from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I think, used an appropriate example. So either you can kind of speed over a speed bump or you can go around it. So the law right now is really looking at, the speed bump's meant to slow me down and stop me from doing things, but if I go around it, am I really breaking the law? Like, is there really a consequence of that? And what you really described is, okay, I'm going around the speed bump. But what's the consequence of that? Is it really breaking the law in any way? And so the problem is that, your implementation might not be what people in the technologist community would consider unauthorized access. In the law, there is really not there's a very broad definition of unauthorized access. And so because it doesn't delineate, like, these are examples of unauthorized access, or even the legislative history, because the law is so old, has no conversation about what would constitute unauthorized access. So there aren't these current examples of what would constitute that. And so I think that as the law is revised, hopefully we can get technologists to discuss, this really isn't unauthorized access, and kind of try to take that technology and translate it. And I think that brings up an important point. Technologists are very useful in translating what's happening, a very technical process. A 70-year-old legislator is not going to understand. Being able to translate that and distill it and show that that isn't unauthorized access and make sure that that's reflected when the law is revised.
Sounds like you have your work cut out for you. Thank you really for joining us in this. It was timely when we said we should do this. It's even more timely now with some of the issues that are in front of us this week and last week. So really appreciate you coming in and telling us, giving us this insider view. It was very interesting. Up next, Francine Bennett and Duncan Ross. They say, tongue-in-cheek, I hope, being evil is much more fun than being good, and it gets you paid a lot more. Francine and Duncan submitted some interesting proposals, and they've even given themselves evil rating. Apparently Duncan gets 5 stars and Fran gets only 4. They're going to talk about using data for evil, a beginner's guide. Take it away, guys.
Good afternoon, America.
Hello.
My name's Duncan Ross, and I'm a data miner. And although my job is to work as Director of Data Science for Teradata, I'm speaking here as a member of DataKind. And normally DataKind is there to help us think about how we do good with data. But I'm really going to be trying to focus in this presentation on some of the easy ways that people can do evil.
And hello, I'm Francine Bennett, and I run Mastodon C. I'm also a data miner or data scientist, and together we're going to talk from various parts of the spectrum about how to be most evil. Duncan being the more senior partner in the evil group, it seems. So, getting started. As you can tell, we both have British accents, which means we must be evil, or royal, or possibly even both. And we want to talk about how a talented data scientist can be evil, and it doesn't really need to be about the big things. So we all have the ability to make the world a tiny bit worse by our grey hat behaviors. And we want to talk about some of the biggest things you can do to be evil or not evil, and some excellent hints about how to maximize evil with the least possible effort.
So you do need to think a little bit about the role of data in the world at the moment and the view that the media take of data. And one of the easiest ways you can be evil, it's almost the zeroth law of doing evil with data, is that simply by not doing good, you're encouraging the media to think about data and databases in terms of 1984. Which is a bit sad, really, because it means we don't think about all the good things that happened in 1984. Mark Zuckerberg was born. I think that was about it, really. But nevertheless, so data has this inbuilt scare factor when it comes to the media. Just not doing good is one of the best ways you can do evil with this. And the key thing here is that actually there are lots of ways you can accidentally do good with data. You could work with an organization like DataKind to do positive things. You could make the world a slightly better place by building better predictive models. You don't actually need to be a hacker to do evil, but hopefully we're going to steer you away from some of the more common mistakes that we see people making when they're trying to do evil in the world.
So, first mistake if you're trying to be evil is thinking too hard about the impact of what you do. So we all know that analysis is very cool and very powerful. As data scientists or data miners, we can do some pretty awesome things nowadays, and our analysis can have quite a lot of effect on people's behavior. So by using models and data in a really smart way, and without stealing any data, without hacking into anything at all, we can make people do things that they wouldn't normally want to, or they might not necessarily want to. So the ways to avoid getting too worried about this stuff, of course, are to never measure the results of what you do, never think too hard about the human beings behind what you do, and just don't worry too hard about what might happen.
We promised to give you case studies here. Now, to be honest, there were so many potential case studies along the way that this was rather like this year at the Oscars. I mean, honorable mention should go to Facebook Graph, Google Street View, and Target, to mention but a few. But the one that we chose to go with to think about the danger of caring about the impact is a nice little UK organisation, the UK Border Agency. Now, the UK Border Agency is the UK agency. It's a Crown agency, which shows how important it is, and its task is to secure the borders of the UK from dangerous foreigners and the like. Now, it doesn't have a great track record in this. It's done accidental things in the past, like forgetting to ask people as they came through Heathrow for their passports. But they realized that this was a problem, and they thought they could do something with data. Now, the first mistake they made, of course, was actually in handing this over to a private sector organization who they reasonably thought might be better at doing the job than they would themselves. So they handed the data over to Capita and they said, see what you can do with this. And the great thing that Capita did is they decided to build a model that very simply identified people who shouldn't have stayed in the UK, people who had come in on visas and the visa had either been given out erroneously or the terms of the visa had ended, and they decided it would be pretty straightforward to get those people, identify a telephone number associated with them, and send out a text message saying, you really shouldn't be in the UK, go away. Unfortunately, or fortunately in terms of doing evil, they didn't actually check that against any other databases to make sure that any of their assumptions were correct. And so they ended up sending texts to people who were allowed to stay, several texts to people who were no longer in the country anyway, and this caused a little bit of a national scandal. And now the Information Commissioner and various other legal bodies are looking into this to see what they should really have been doing instead. So the key lesson from that, of course, is if you want to do the maximum evil using that kind of data crunching, you should make sure your data scientist is kept as far away from the actual business knowledge as is possible. You should think about the numbers involved and definitely don't think about people who might be on the end of those. And to put that into a more mathematical frame of mind, you shouldn't think too much about the differential impact of different decisions. So in the case of the UK Border Agency, they could have made a number of different errors. The type 2 error was simply not to send the message to someone who should be encouraged to leave the country. The type 1 error, which is the type of error that they didn't think about very much, which was excellent news, was to send get-out messages to someone who is allowed to stay. Inevitably, this had the impact of making people very upset, scaring people who might otherwise have lived perfectly normal and harmless lives.
So, moving on to a slightly different area, Duncan's just talked about the first mistake if you want to be evil is to care about the impact of your data. The second mistake if you want to be properly evil is to anonymize really well.
And I'm going to interject here to actually say one of the greatest errors in anonymization is spelling it with a Z rather than with an S.
Yes, very good point. American spelling is clearly the wrong kind. So there is nothing better if you're trying to be truly evil than revealing people's dirty secrets. And you can often do it pretty well with data that they freely shared with you. So you can find out people's health status, their sexuality, even bank account information without doing any hacking, just using freely given data quite a lot of the time. And I think Duncan can tell us about a specific example from one telco.
Yes, a telco who shall remain anonymous did a little bit of analysis. And what they found out is that it's very easy to map the paths of human relationships simply by looking at the frequently called numbers and the locations from which the numbers are called. So if you know the A number, the B number, and the cell site, you can see the moment people fall in love. You see the long late-night telephone calls from different locations that seem to go on forever as people find it difficult to put down the phone. Then you can spot the moment they move in together, when those late-night calls disappear, and instead you get these short calls at the end of the working day as people are leaving work, heading home, and being asked to pick up things. You move on to see the growth of a new set of long late-night calls, often made from other cell sites than the cell site you assume to be the home, and this is the indication that the affair is starting. And then, of course, you see the calls to the lawyers as life moves into divorce and so on. And these patterns are very easy to pick up as a data scientist.
So that's a fine example of how data that you might have been quite happy that your telco has and you might not be bothered how to use it can actually be used to find out an awful lot about your life. And as a data scientist, it's pretty cool but pretty evil to work those things out about people. And looking at a classic example of anonymization not quite working, it's really hard to guarantee anonymity. So the more data you link together, the easier it is to work back to who a person actually is. So second-rate anonymization is classic and is worth its weight in gold. And is a famous example is the Netflix prize, which you probably all have heard of, where Netflix released all their movie rental data, anonymized apparently, and this was actually quite successfully de-anonymized using IMDb ratings. So a couple of researchers from the University of Texas worked out how to track back from that to who the people in the Netflix data were, and then you could see exactly every movie that someone had watched, and not just the ones that they'd wanted to publicly advertise on IMDb. And it's pretty easy to imagine ways in which that might make some people pretty unhappy. I suspect that one of the guys who wrote the paper, Narayanan, is possibly also poking around in some other things. I heard his name mentioned earlier on today as possibly someone who's messing with Alistair's Google Analytics logs. So you might want to track that one down.
And just to emphasize, one of the fun things that Christina touched upon, this idea of legislation around privacy. In Europe, we have a quite well-developed data protection directive that the EU produced based on some initial legislation in 1995. And as you can guess from that, if it was based in 1995, it predates the World Wide Web, and it predates the growth of social media quite extensively. But even there, the focus is on a one-dimensional view of data and data privacy. And the assumption is that if you can treat the core data carefully, that somehow anonymization and privacy is guaranteed. But what every research study has shown is that one of the key issues on anonymization is always the ability to link multiple data sets together and produce a fingerprint which uniquely or almost uniquely identifies people. For example, if I know that Alistair Croll drives a Porsche 911 and I know roughly where he lives, I can simply walk around that neighborhood until I see a Porsche 911. Of course, if I'm particularly lazy, I could just use Google Street View, which would get me to the same answer without actually having to leave my evil data lair.
So moving on to another mistake you might make if you're trying to be evil and not quite succeeding. Volcanoes, which are a classic lair of the mad genius. So as you're doing data science, you would tend to use quite a lot of servers. And it's something which we don't often think about, but calling out a massive fleet of servers, that uses a lot of energy and has quite a big carbon impact, which is a big issue, obviously, for the world in the future. So building a data center in a volcano can actually be, unfortunately, a good thing to do. So geothermal energy is very clean, and the most important factor in the carbon footprint of the servers that you run is not about the efficiency of the servers themselves, it's where does the energy come from that runs them. So probably the worst kind of site you can put your servers on is East US, Virginia is running on coal. If you run things on geothermal energy, then the carbon footprint is massively smaller. And that's quite a big way to have an impact on the world. So 3 servers in Virginia has about the same carbon footprint as 1 person in the UK for a year. So it's pretty big impact you can have on the world by running a lot of servers in the wrong place.
How can you avoid this mistake? Well, come on, it's pretty obvious. Don't build your evil data center in a volcano. But if you can't get away with that and your management start asking difficult questions, the first technique is simply to stare them down, look at them as if they're a 2-year-old until they go away. Of course, if that doesn't work, then you may have to distract them with talk about the green credentials of the machines that are being used. And this is an actual quote from a company's website. I've anonymized it so that we can't tell which company it is, unless, of course, you actually search the text on Google. The X is extremely energy efficient. Save up to 75% on energy costs compared to an x86 alternatives, and the more you grow your workload inside a machine, the greater your energy savings. The outstanding virtualization capabilities can support up to 50 distributed servers on a single core, up to 1,000 on a single system, resulting in a greener IT for Linux workloads on X, up to 60% more performance at 35% lower price, delivering a virtual Linux server for under $1 a day. What a brilliant piece of doublethink. George Orwell would be proud. So moving on towards this, the theme of this entire talk has really been around taking personal responsibility for doing evil in the world. And we looked onto the internet and we actually found a pledge that someone has put together to try and do the opposite of that. And it's really quite unpleasant reading. It encourages people to do a number of things. Firstly, to be aware of the outcome and impact of their analysis.
And the second point being that they should not be arrogant. They should avoid hubris and not assume they should do something just because they can.
Even more disturbing, it encourages people to actually do positive good and be an agent for change, using analytical powers for the public service.
And finally, using this word makes me especially queasy as an English person. I will be awesome. I will reach out to those who need me and take their cause further than they could possibly imagine.
And can you imagine the damage that would be done to the world of evil if people signed up to this pledge and actually adopted this into their everyday analytical and data science lives? We couldn't live with that. So we actually thought about how we could reverse that and make it much more relevant to those of us who want to do evil. And the starting point clearly has to be not worrying about the impact or outcome of your analysis. As long as that's someone else's problem, then you're on the first stage of your road to becoming an evil data genius.
And of course, the second point, as a data genius, you have earned the right to be arrogant. By the power of analysis, you can outshine the gods themselves. So you should always assume you should do something just because you can and because it's a pretty beautiful model.
I really like that last one. I do like the idea that the gods themselves will answer to data science soon. Of course, this doesn't do any good if you're active in the world and actually try and help people. So where possible, be passive. Don't use your analytical powers for positive good. If an opportunity to do good with analytics turns up, make sure you need to go and get some coffee or go and talk to your friends or attend an online conference, anything that will take you away from actually doing good with your skills.
And of course, the final point, if you want to be properly evil, is to keep your analytical skills to yourself. So the less they know, the better. Don't tell anyone how to do these things or what you're doing. Indeed, just be as untransparent as humanly possible.
This is good for a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, it keeps the number of us in the industry limited, which pushes up our wages. But it also means that people don't understand the positive power that analytics could be in this world, the things that we could do for the public good if we chose to do them. Really, that's the end of what we wanted to talk about. We hope it's been at least slightly amusing, and we want to thank particularly the villains everywhere in the world, Hank Scorpio, Dr. Doofenshmirtz, and Alistair Croll. Now, I don't know that Alistair is actually evil, but if anyone ever wants to be evil with data, he's got the right name for it.
And of course, as evil data scientists, we need to say boo to the good guys. So Bond, James Bond, Jake Porway and DataKind, which is a core of data scientists who are trying to do good things in the world. It seems like a shocking idea. And of course, UN Global Pulse, who are trying to use data for good. Again, dangerous stuff.
All right, guys, thank you very much. And I just want to let you know minions and henchmen have been dispatched to wherever you guys are hiding. Interesting take on that. I think certainly, the idea here of consequences has come up a few times. Earlier on, people were saying legislators are making laws that take 3 or 4 years to file, trying to anticipate a world 10 years from now. It's only just over 10 years ago that Apple was branding its computers based on the fruit color they had. And that seems like a pretty far cry from a world where today we have 3 different tablets staring at our screens trying to sell us iStuff. So anticipating that kind of stuff and thinking about consequences, even if one devoted one's time to consequences, how on earth can you figure that out? I mean, the fact that you can look at IMDb and Netflix and find out what kind of porn people have been watching. I mean, those consequences seem so far-reaching that it almost makes you want to curl up in a ball and say, I can't possibly anticipate the future, so I won't act. Is there any way to anticipate that stuff, or is it just sort of drinking with Hillary Mason and brainstorming about the worst that could possibly happen?
Well, it's very difficult to anticipate what porn you'll be watching, Alistair. But you can at least spend time thinking about potential consequences. All too often in our industry, there is a divorce between the world of the analyst, which is often sitting a long way from the coalface of what's going on in the real world, and real people out there. Even if we can't predict everything, and I accept that we can't understand fully the impact of things. Often some of the worst disasters in the world have happened through good intentions. But at least trying to anticipate some of them, trying to see some of the issues that might arise, is both personally responsible and also responsible within the company that you're working for, because both you and that company are likely to be legally liable should you step over the line.
All right, sorry, go ahead, Brent.
Sorry, very quick one. I think there's an additional issue, which is, data scientists and analysts is a profession that's becoming extremely powerful and is relatively new in many industries. And we as a group haven't yet really developed norms about what's okay, what's not okay. So regardless of the legal issues, I think we need to figure it out as a professional group. What do we do about this?
All right. One quick question from you guys, and then we got to move on. We did get a couple of people asking us in the Q&A stuff here. And this is a pretty nuanced one. Daniel Venditelli, I hope I'm saying all his names properly. Do you see the death or dissolution of privacy, as Jeff Jarvis and others see it, reduces the value of some of these hacks as a positive or a negative thing? And I think to expand on the question a little bit, as we live our lives in public, the amount of evil someone can do by threatening to reveal something about ourselves goes away. I mean, as a person with, as you said, an evil genius but also uniquely Googleable name, I think there's one other guy named Alistair Croll that shows up on Google. He's a diamond miner in South Africa somewhere, and he's on like the 5th page of results. It's pretty clear that someone could steal my identity, but they probably couldn't do too many things, this is not an invitation, that I'm not already disclosing. I swear quite a lot on my Twitter feed, and I'm loud and obnoxious at parties. how does that change? I mean, as we live in a world where everyone's public persona is assumed, there was this article in Der Spiegel a little while ago after the shootings in Norway about how people who don't have social media profiles are immediately considered suspicious by the authorities. As we live our lives in public like this, how does the damage one can do go away, or is it worsened?
Well, I think part of the problem is that we don't have a good social model of privacy that works in the modern age. We tend to view things like identity and privacy as being binary. Either something is private or something is public. But actually there are gradations of public and private. So there are things that I would be happy for my family to know or my friends to know that I wouldn't be happy for people in the wider world, like my employer or people I might meet on the street to know. So we need a much more nuanced model. The argument that if everything was in the open, that somehow the world would be a safer place just doesn't seem to work well with the way that people are designed to operate. People tend to have secrets, even when sense says that that's maybe not the right way. So I don't know the straightforward answer to that, but I think it's a much more nuanced and complex thing than might be suggested from some of the simpler discourse that's been on the subject.
Hi, Alistair. Are you still with us?
Yeah, I am. I'm still here. Sorry. Thank you, guys. Our next speaker is Joe Pritchard. He's going to put an even more explicit set of instructions in front of you, how to crowdsource large-scale identity theft and fraud to make bucket loads of easy money. And if any federal or state prosecutors listening, we do not mean this. This is irony. We're actually telling you how not to do it. But it should be a fascinating topic. I'm really wondering if the next time I cross the border into the States, I'm going to have a long conversation with men in blue gloves as a result of this presentation. So, Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Alistair. Yasmina is going to help me I've dropped off the session, so Yaz is going to help me advance slides. Today, what we're going to talk about is really how to combat these large-scale operations and what it looks like in data. So I'm going to walk you through first the types of schemes and scams that are prevalent right now, and then talk about how we as LexisNexis look at big data and analytics to combat that. So yeah, the next slide. This is slide 2, where you should see a Venn diagram of the 3 key ingredients you need to pull off a large-scale scheme. And this applies to many different types of fraud. This could be stage action fraud in insurance. It could be prescription drug fraud. What we do is we use very similar techniques to combat all of these different types of schemes. But really what you need to do is for these types of identity theft, you need to have a good solid source of valid identities. And in the US, that means valid social security number with matching first and last name, and date of birth if you can get it. But in many cases, you don't even need that. So you need as many of those identities as possible. Then the second ingredient you need is you need to have somebody who has key knowledge about the system that you're trying to hack. So if it's benefits fraud, you need to have somebody who knows all the checks and balances and all the processes that you have to go through to receive benefits. If it's tax refund fraud, you need to have somebody who knows all the systems to bypass all those thresholds and checks and balances that the IRS put in place. And then the third thing that you need, and this is really crucial in terms of scale, is you need a trusted network. Because if you as a single person decide you're going to try and pull off a large-scale sprawling fraud, and you're sending it all to one address, the organization in question will very quickly be able to pick that up based on thresholds. So what you need to be able to do is diffuse it out through a social network. So what you need to do is rope in all your trusted friends and associates so that they can commandeer multiple addresses in different locations all over the country, and you can really spread it out through your social network. Next slide, yes. Slide 3. So we'll start off by talking about tax refund fraud because the date for filing is coming up, and this is really important for everybody to know about. I'm going to tell you an anecdotal story about what happened in the previous year. Is the law enforcement in Tampa were thrilled because all the drug dealers had disappeared off the streets, and apparently their efforts at cleaning up the streets were really paying off. And after a while, the post office, who are very sensitive about you opening people's mail that isn't yours, noticed that people were following their postal delivery guys around and going through the mailboxes after them and pulling things out and disappearing. And it was systematic. It was happening on many routes, and a lot of the delivery people were noticing this. So they did an investigation, and they found out that debit cards were being delivered to those addresses for people who didn't live there, and people were picking them up behind the delivery people. When they investigated, they found out those debit cards stemmed from the IRS, and they spoke to the IRS and said, you do know that people are stealing debit cards from mailboxes in the Tampa area en masse. And the IRS said, we don't have a problem. So the post office investigated, and they ended up catching the former drug dealers with $100 million worth of uncashed debit cards on them. So it's how do you pull off something in that scale? What makes it possible for them to do that? And the answer is very simple. They managed to source a bunch of identities. Primarily in that case, it was deceased identities. And all they needed was social, first name, last name, and e-filing has made it incredibly easy to file a return and request a refund without ever having to send any documentation in. Because by the time they figure out that it's fraudulent, they're going to be chasing the real person whose refund that was. And you're going to be out the door. You're going to have your debit card, you're going to have cashed the money, and you've left the building. And so that's a huge opportunity for fraudsters, and they can really do it in scale because the systems have helped them. It's given them the means to be able to pull it off in scale. And what they do is they spread it out through every single mailbox in an entire neighborhood so that all addresses are scrambled, and they have a couple of refunds going to one address and another to another. It's incredibly organized. If we can go to the next slide, Yaz. The next thing it brings me to is where are these opportunities to really find loopholes and easy targets in terms of both using identities and in scale extracting money out of organizations. So the next one we'll talk about is disaster relief fraud. In this particular case, it's relevant because Hurricane Sandy has hit and government are really keen to help as they should. The area that's hardest hit. Same thing happened in Hurricane Katrina. These opportunities give the fraudsters the chance to really look at leveraging the identities that they hold and can get hold of to extract small amounts of money in scale so that they're very difficult to detect. Even in cases like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill gave fraudsters an incredible opportunity to claim that their business is being hit by this. And what you find is it's very difficult to very quickly pierce the ownership of businesses. To be able to tell that a business was only taken off the shelf and now they're pretending to be a real business 2 months later and claiming benefits back or claiming funds back from FEMA, that's hard, intensive work to be able to pierce that. So this gives them an incredible opportunity to extract money in 1,000 little cuts, but to bleed them dry. So if we go on to the next slide, what I want to talk about here is the types of identities that are most at risk to be used by these large-scale fraud schemes. The obvious one that I've spoken about is deceased individuals. What happens there is for tax refund fraud, it takes a while to round up, to wrap up the estate. And by the time the estate files the tax refund request, what happens is that the IRS says, "Oh, I'm sorry, we've already paid the money out for that ID." And in some cases, people, officers who've died in the line of duty, people who've died in Afghanistan in the line of duty, their widows find out later that they have to spend 16 to 18 months fighting with the IRS to get money that's due to them, and that's really sad. Children are also at risk because they don't have any presence, certainly in public records and other places, for anybody to notice. So those identities, those footprints aren't watched as carefully. And the last one is Puerto Ricans are interesting because in the U.S., Puerto Ricans don't have to file a tax return if they live in Puerto Rico, but they have a valid social and name combination, which makes them ideal because they're never going to file their return only to find out that it was fraudulently filed before them. So those three are the key places that you can source identities in scale and pull off one of these schemes. So those need to be scrutinized more carefully. The places that are most susceptible to these kind of schemes are generally benefits programs in government. They tended to have the opinion that if they check with the Social Security Administration as to whether you have a valid social name combination, that's a pretty good test of authenticity. And as we know, that's not working out so well. So really all you need is a valid social name combination, and you're good. You can file a refund request for $6,000–$7,000, and the IRS, their job is to pay money. So they'll be really efficient at paying those refunds off because they're well below any thresholds that would raise suspicion. Then you really need to understand how to scale these operations out. What you want to do is be able to look at getting valid identity information, and then you need a bunch of local addresses that you can commandeer through your social network. So you need that large trusted network. If you go to the next slide, yes. So this is slide 6, and we're going to talk a bit about who LexisNexis Risk Solutions is. For those of you who know of our sister company, which is LexisNexis Legal and Professional, we are not that company. We are Risk Solutions. We aggregate large amounts of data, and we use that to do risk analytics for various verticals. You can see here insurance, financial services, healthcare, government. And what we do is we use the full length and breadth of our data assets to provide those risk analytics solutions. We cover 100% of the US P&C, property and casualty insurance carriers. We work with 100% of the top 50 US banks, 90% of the Fortune 500 companies, and we work with all 50 US states, local governments, and also 80% of the federal agencies. So what we're really doing is we work with companies to try and use analytics and compute power and data to combat these kinds of schemes. If you go on to the next slide, yes. Slide 7, I want to talk briefly about how we do this. The way to be able to use the full length and breadth of the data is you need massively powerful data-intensive supercompute capabilities. And this, for us, LexisNexis, comes in the form of HPCC systems, which last year we open sourced to the community. So everything that, all of the power that we use is available to everybody else to use too. It's an alternative to Hadoop. It has 3 key parts to it. It is, we have our batch system, which is Thor, which allows us to do massive batch processing of data, similar to Hadoop. The second part we have is Roxy, which is our high-speed delivery engine, which allows us to do high-speed queries against massive indexes and deliver those results in real time. And the third part is we have a unified language across all of those components, which is ECL, which is really a language for data scientists. It's designed to do data-intensive work, and it also removes the layer of worrying about how you have to scale it out and how you have to work with the hardware to be able to do those scaled out operations. You focus on what is it that you want to do. You describe it as a data declarative language, so you describe the operation that you want to do and you focus on doing rather than worrying about the architecture underneath. That gets taken care of. If anybody else wants to know more about that, because this is not really the forum and I don't have the time, if you go to hpccsystems.com, there you'll find a bunch of information about that. But what I do want to talk about is what this technology allows us to do from the perspective of protecting identity. So if you go to the next slide, yes, which is LexID. So from our perspective, LexID is built on top of our high-speed or our massively parallel compute capacity. What we're able to do is we have a patented learning algorithm, that the more data we give it, the better it is at linking. And linking is, in terms of people, is really identity resolution. We have 4 terabytes of data that covers businesses, people, assets. And what we're able to do is we're able to take all of those identity fragments and compare them against every other identity fragment to generate, did I say terabytes? It's 4 petabytes of data. It makes a huge difference, that number. But we're able to take every single identity fragment and compare it to every other identity fragment. And by doing that, we can use a set of guidelines rather than a set of rules to specify weightings in terms of how different fragments match. And then we use a learning algorithm that clusters them to figure out where identities are resolved. And in doing so, it becomes a massive n-square challenge to be able to compare every fragment to every other fragment. But we rebuild the entire world every month on the US population. And we're only able to do that because we've got this large-scale compute capacity. But what it does do is it ties all those identity fragments together. So if you go on to slide 9, which is evolving identities, what that allows us to do is, because we have data that covers people, businesses, and assets, it allows us to more comprehensively stitch together the nature of identity from the perspective of our own data assets. And because they go back up to 20 to 30 years historically, and they cover so many different data sources, we're more able to stitch together certain aspects of an identity's life. And in doing so, we're able to provide a backdrop for any unusual changes in that identity. So what we're able to do is we're able to build variables that describe how your identity emerges in data. We're able to build variables that describe geographically where we expect to see you. And then what we can do is, and we build out all these variables, and eventually what we're able to do is if we're given a name, address, social, we can contrast that against the intelligence that we know about who you are and where you should be, and then use that to create risk analytics to say, that's an unusual behavior for you, and those look more suspicious or not suspicious. But to do that, we really have to build this master context on the population, on the entire population. We need to know the specificities of all of the name combinations. So you, as John Smith, how specific is that? If your name is Flavio Villanustre, it's highly specific. So given each fragment of data, we can actually build weightings on that and understand which key identity indicators make you you. And then use the full length and breadth of our data assets to really understand how people's data flows across time and when unusual things happen. If you suddenly file from an address that we've never seen you from, it's more easy for us to be able to do that. But the one thing that we need is we need data to do that. If you've taken the idea that you need to protect your data by not ever publishing anything and by not ever buying a car or a house, and you want to hide off the public data grid or the public records data grid, what happens is that you don't have a dominant ID in data. It's easier for a fraudster to come along and to pretend to be you, because they can be a more authentic version of you in data and steal your identity. And when we check it, if the IRS or if a bank comes to us and said, is this the real Joe Pritchard, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference because the other Joe Pritchard looks far more real and authentic. So really, as a consumer, it's counterintuitive. You need to make sure that you publish the best version of you through data. When you buy a car, when you get a license, when you do all the things that could result in your data showing up in public record, make sure that you keep it up to date. It's the only way that we can help people is to really garner the use of the most data we could possibly lay our hands on. We can use the full strength of our compute capacity and our smart analytics like LexID to really focus on solving these real human problems. If you go on to the last slide, slide 10, yes. So this is really about being the best version of you in data. It's about controlling your identity to make sure your electronic footprint works for you. And that's really thinking about how you appear in data and making sure that you are publishing the most dominant version of you in data. There's an excellent episode, Identity Crisis and Person of Interest, where exactly that happens, where the real Jordan Hester takes over the other person's identity. And if you ever watch that episode, you'll see exactly how that happens. And to remind you that if you don't publish the best version of you, it's easier for somebody to pretend to be you in data. So the other thing you need to keep in mind is if you file early your tax return in the US, you will limit the opportunity for fraudsters to file before you. So that's a hint for you today. When you move address and change address for anything, make sure you update your addresses everywhere that you can possibly update it. Don't be slack and only do it in 6 months to a year's time. All of those provide windows of opportunity for other people to do account takeover and create synthetic identities of your identity. Keep tabs on your credit score. That's an easy one. But it does remind you that you have to manage your public data footprint just like you manage your FICO score, and you can do simple things to keep that under control. Keep your address current on everything, especially your employers and things like that. The other part is if you're using unified social media logins, one of the key things is if you compromise one, you compromise all, so you've got to protect those carefully. But the other part of it is you need to make sure that social identity is a real reflection of you, and you've got to manage that. We tell our kids, watch how you publish your identity and things you say on Facebook. But the same applies to all of us. That is a representation of you. The more it's being used as a unified login, the more it will be used to authenticate you. And we can authenticate that in the future. We'll be authenticating the realness of a virtual identity based on their social footprint in the real world. And that's very important. You've got to pick your friends wisely because it'll be a reflection of you. The moment those two worlds merge, you've got to think ahead and think that out. So the key things to remember is that the more data we have, the better we are at resolving identity, and HPCC systems plays a key role in that. And smart analytics will be better at understanding how to protect identity in the future as we go forward.
All right, thanks, Joe. It sounds like this is good for a force for good and a force for evil. And obviously, everything you said here about trying to understand who the fraudsters are provides an opportunity for those fraudulent people to do something back. One question in the Q&A for you. Do you guys implement mining tools that pull data in from social media APIs to consume that data?
It's a good question. We don't. There are two reasons. The first reason is that we have some legal implications that that world hasn't quite been explored legally enough from our perspective, and we're very tightly regulated in terms of privacy laws and access to our data. So we're reluctant at this stage to pull too much data in from the internet, certainly. The other part of it is that we build our own social graph internally. So we have a social graph that is built of cohabitation, shared assets, and shared business ownership. And that tends to be, and there are 400 billion relationships between the 270-ish active identities in our data. And that tends to be the trusted social network, as opposed to on social media, you can have 5,000 friends and only 3 of them are actually friends in real life with you. So what we have to do is that can introduce a massive amount of noise for us, and we're very focused on, one thing I wasn't talking about today was graph analytics to really tackle these large-scale schemes. We use that heavily all over the place for every type of fraud, waste, and abuse. We use that in many ways, our social graph, and we have analytics that use the full brute strength of HPCC systems to be able to do that in scale. So we do algorithms that calculate mortgage fraud in social groups and prescription drug fraud, and I have a whole separate world that exists around that, and that is fruitful beyond anything that anybody can imagine. The key thing to remember there is all of this data lasts forever. If you thought in 2006 you'd never get caught because you got away with it, the data is only accumulating faster, and the analytics are only getting better, and platforms like HPCC systems and Hadoop are only making it easier to be able to look back retroactively and go, oh my gosh, what were you thinking? Thinking that you'd get away with that. So keep that in mind.
Well, I mean, what strikes me there is that Duncan and Fran were talking about tax fraud that flies below the radar of refunds. The radar is getting down to ground level very quickly with cheap computing, it seems. So a lot of those loopholes are going to get closed simply because the cost of doing it is now vanishingly small.
Yeah.
One quick observation in this, we talked about evil overlords and Bond villains. It seems to me that when you watch movies from the 70s and they have this old trope where the detective walks in and plays the last message on the answering machine, that sort of went away, right? We don't have answering machines anymore. In the same way, when Moneypenny hands Bond some passports and says, "Here you go, James, your cover ID is so-and-so," that becomes almost impossible in the era of social graphs. With technology like this, if someone says, "I'm John Smith from Universal Exports," someone could very quickly go, "That's interesting, John Smith. You have no friends on Facebook, and everybody I know who you are friends with is a sock puppet. You must be a spy. Prepare to die." A lot of those tropes that we've sort of taken to identify as normal, that the entire movie plots are built on, kind of collapse the way that a Hitchcock movie would fall apart if someone had a mobile phone.
Absolutely. One of the things that we actually do is we have an authentication mechanism that using your virtual identity, a Facebook account or something similar, and your friends that you have, we can actually authenticate whether you're real or not just by the relationships alone. And that's in the US because our context, this master context we built is based on US data, 4 petabytes of US data. But what we're able to do is to say, well, if you're John Smith, but you're friends with Mary Smith and Duncan Elliott, then we know which John Smith you are, just on that alone. But it gives us a way to use our master context that we have to really authenticate virtual identities. But it's bidirectional because we can authenticate your friends too. And if you look real, but none of your friends look real, that's probably bad. So you not only would an ID fraudster need to steal your virtual account, they'd also have to steal the virtual accounts of every single one of your real friends to prove that they were the real you. They can't just create a new fake social media account to pretend that they're you. They would have to create fake social media accounts for all of your friends as well and know who they are to be able to do that.
So it's a lot like taking the sort of VeriSign model of peered approval through shared public keys and stuff and applying it to people too.
Correct. It's creating a social graph version of it.
Right. All right. Thank you very much, Joe. Fascinating conversation. And not to be left behind, Vish Romaro is going to talk to us about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this. We've talked a lot about how to do evil. What happens when your machine learning gets attacked and you're the recipient of some of that evil, and how do you fight back? Go ahead, Vish.
Yeah. So we've seen all morning how you can pretty much attack any system, and we've not seen too much about the solutions for those problems. We just covered a bit about online identity and how data can help you manage that problem. But one of the classical ways to counter an attack is to implement a machine learning algorithm that can learn those attacks and be able to classify them. I'm Vish Ramarao, currently the co-founder and CTO of Impermium. Prior to this, I've worked about 14 years in search, business analytics, and mail. And today I'm going to be talking about actionable ways to implement a strong machine learning solution to counter attacks. So the general realm of machine learning to manage these attacks is under the umbrella of adversarial machine learning. And there are a variety of both classical and new problems that are under this umbrella. There are clearly the new problems of fraudulent account creation, account compromise, malicious logins, and content moderation, but also more older and well-established problems like mail spam, web spam, and click fraud. All of these problems have a very clear characteristic. They have an adversary who has incentives to attack the solution and to gain from it. So I'm going to review very quickly what classical supervised implementations look like. There are 4 parts to any of these systems. There is a random process that you're trying to learn about. It's typically considered a stationary process, something that does not change behavior in a classical setting. Clearly, that's different in an adversarial setting. There is a feature extraction and representation system that tries to represent the data that is required to be able to make a decision. And there are classical ways to do it. N-grams and bag of words are classic text-based feature representation systems. There's a big part of this which is training data, which really is what the crux of the problem is, to be able to learn from prior behavior. Typically obtained through a feedback loop where people give you feedback and say this is right and this is wrong, as well as emerging systems like crowdsourcing, where you can ask a large body of workers on what the right decision for any given situation needs to be. Finally, there is the learning algorithm itself, and people have heard about naive Bayes and boosted trees and support vector machines. The adversarial problem is quite similar. It still has a learning algorithm that is trying to classify incoming data into one of two categories. But the key difference here is that there's an adversary who's observing the output of the learning system and is willing to adapt the data that he emits in order to fool the system, in order to change the behavior of the system. But there are cost and time constraints. It's not that the adversary has free reign over everything that happens in the system. There are clearly a constraint where a subset of the data that he presents to the system can be changed, but to change all of the data to really re-represent the whole thing, it either takes more money or resources, or it takes a longer time to do that. And that's where an adversarial system has an advantage, and an adversarial machine learning system has an advantage to be able to latch onto those weaknesses and be able to counter the attack. I'm going to be talking about engineering patterns or system design patterns across three primary areas: feature engineering, training, and algorithms. And in doing so, I will be covering a bit about architecture, process, and tools on how to design these systems. So let's first look at feature engineering. Feature engineering is the art, as some say, of representing data in a manner where a classification system is further able to make decisions on what to do with that data. So the first distinct pattern that we notice when we're designing an adversarial system is that you can't start off with simple features. These features need to be smart. If you take an example of text representation, the simple way of doing that would be a bag of words approach, but anybody who's dealt with an anti-spam system knows very easily that it can be defeated. It can be very easily defeated by an adversary who includes spaces and a bunch of other variety of techniques to defeat the system. So pattern one on feature engineering really talks about how to be smart about tokenization or feature extraction in the first step itself. You can't obviously assume that all of this data that you're going to represent with is going to be easy to work with. So you have to really essentially focus on making some parts of that represented correctly or cajoled into a canonical form, and the rest of it needs to be obviously left for the later part of system design. So the second pattern that we notice in many of these systems is that anomalous features, things that are unexpected in the data, are a big part of the feature engineering problem. It manifests itself in hash busters in text. You look at anomalous user agent strings in many of the botnet-oriented systems. And all of these become interesting vectors to represent for a downstream machine learning classifier. But a key differentiator, again, between a classical system and an adversarial system is that the adversarial systems are Darwinian systems. The most successful attack survives, and it's very important for us as system designers to be able to log and count and analyze the data that we're looking at to be able to spot these anomalies and to catch them before they become too big. A third very interesting pattern in feature engineering here is relative representation. When you look at data, you can either look at the value of the data and say, I'm going to learn something about the value, or you can look at the value and say, how does this value compare relatively to all the values that I have with me? One advantage a defense system has is that the adversary does not control all of the data that the system is seeing. He controls a slice of that data. So when you're able to index into the wide feature vector of all the data that the system is able to have access to, you make it difficult for an adversary to game the system, to engineer the system. A very good example of this is how at Impermium we we implement a solution called recently popular items. What we do is fairly simple. We look at two groups of people, a control group and a test group. Suppose for the minute that the control group is made up of people who are old, established users of a system, and the test group would be new users who are signing up to a system. When we compare the data emitted by the two groups, we notice immediately that in many of the spammy situations, the test group, the new user group, emits common words like click and buy and sell and things like that much more frequently than the control group, which is an old user base that is not interested in gaming the system. So things like these differentials become very, very important in feature representation. Another realization here with adversarial machine learning is about the sparsity or wideness of the feature vector. It's very, very common to notice that a subset of these features are useful at any given point in time, but not all of them are useful throughout the lifespan of a system. So it becomes almost useless to do feature selection because it's very likely that what you have eliminated in the previous step through feature selection may be exactly the feature that you need in the next step for classification. So it's not a very productive pattern when designing adversarial systems. But you do need to pay attention to training data sets and be able to capture the latest attack that you expect and be able to measure model drift and problems like that to be able to design the system effectively. So classical systems typically rely on a very highly scalable feature engineering module that works on bag of words or n-grams and does not typically involve an expert who is designing these features. That's not quite true with adversarial systems. An expert-driven feature set needs to be combined very effectively with the standard data sets to be able to produce a wider more effective feature vector from which a system could then subsequently learn. So those are sort of the key takeaways from how to do feature engineering in an adversarial system. I'm going to be talking next about training and what it means to be able to design a training system for many of these adversarial settings. The first, again, pattern that we learn about is about hybrid approach to training. In most systems, you take what your users give as feedback, and you put that back into the training data set, and you try to learn a new set of vectors. Obviously, in an adversarial setting, what you're getting back as feedback might be garbage. It may be gamed. It may be that the adversary has injected data into that loop that would make the learning system vulnerable or weak. So it's very important to have an auditing step in between that would look at the data that you're feeding into the learning modules and be sure that it's not something that you don't want to learn. We see this quite commonly with mail systems where the not spam button is very often gamed, and what you get as not spam feedback is typically the spam that you really want to classify from the very beginning. And you need a tiered system that combines both an automated loop where you're getting feedback from your users, as well as a crowdsourced training loop that allows you to understand what generally your audience or your users think about a particular piece of data, as well as an expert view where a single expert may be able to effectively identify Darwinian variants that are not to be learned on. Crowdsourcing is a very interesting way to get training into the system, and we've seen a number of implementations of crowdsourcing. One of the common ones that we've noticed is a three-way agreement system where you present a piece of data and you ask for feedback or label data back from your agents or your crowd on what should be the right classification for any given vector. The issue with that setup is that the three-way agreement is not quite enough. Many of these systems have, because of an adversary being involved, have very, very different characteristics than classical systems. It's hard sometimes to be able to differentiate between what an adversary has presented or what a spammer or what a schemer has presented and what really should have been the data in the very first place. So it's important to get higher consensus across the board to be able to use that as ground truth for training. Let's look at algorithms as sort of the final subsystem that we're dealing with when designing the ML layer. So there's been a lot of talk and discussion about naive Bayes and how back in 2003, 2004 it was very effectively used for countering spammers, and it's had I think quite a great run. But many of these older algorithms like naive Bayes are not quite suited to modern adversarial systems. The choice of training is a clear problem in many of these systems, and the older algorithms don't quite deal with that effectively. The wide feature vectors of an adversarial setting, where you're looking at a broad swath of data to be able to pick out what an adversary is doing, that again is a detriment to some of the older implementations. So it's very important to use modern algorithms when you're implementing the ML layer. Forest-like algorithms, things that are ensemble-based and support vector machines even that may not be the best choice, but still have a strong ability to choose the data that's used for training are great implementation options for today's engineers. And this is another insight that we pick up on as we design these systems, that sometimes overfitting on the training data set is not at all bad. It's somewhat counterintuitive. Most machine learning practitioners will profess that generalization, or the ability to take any given new feature vector and be able to classify that is a very important goal of the system. And I would agree. The issue that we're talking about, though, here is that 80% of the attacks come from a small number of attackers. So if you can compactly stop those 80% of the attacks, either because you've learned those attacks very, very well, overfitting as it's called in classical machine learning, you're mitigating the problem down to about 20-30%, which is, I think, a great place to be and would really help with system design principles going forward. And it's also very common to see the same attack getting replayed across multiple sites. So if you have learned that attack very quickly, very precisely at the beginning, you're able to stop the attack from spreading too fast. But it's also important to be able to separate the attack detector from the generalized classifier, so that from a systems design perspective, you're not confusing the two systems, and it gets harder and harder to maintain them as one unit. The much reviled blacklists are also a classic example of how an overfitting solution is not quite bad at all. Not everything needs to be classified by the machine learning layer. There are good places to put in a blacklist and reduce the complexity of the machine learning implementation. And that's a pattern that has been, I think, fairly successful so far and continues to be used quite effectively going forward. When possible, it's important to recognize a grouping, and message-oriented systems are notorious for this particular problem. Often people think about, especially with outbound spam, classifying every single outbound message. That's not quite as effective as being able to group all of the messages together and classify users who are emitting those particular documents or those particular messages. So it's a higher order classification problem, and where possible, that's a very important pattern to recognize and implement, because it gets easier and easier as you try to group these documents together and classify them, versus when you're trying to classify individual messages and individual documents. It's also very important to have a reputation system where users involved so that historical behavior becomes an input to prediction algorithms going forward. And behavioral anomalies can be effectively investigated and dealt with. What this all means, end of the day, is that it's easier to achieve the true positive, false positive trade-offs that you're looking for when you're learning at a higher level. Another, again, successful design pattern that we've discovered with many of these implementations is that you definitely need a batch classifier watching over what's happening in an online system. More often than not, the batch algorithm is much more powerful than the online algorithm. It has access to much more historical data and is able to effectively identify these anomalies, identify these patterns that may be the seeds of an attack. And it's important to be able to take those types of situations and put them in a batch context so that the online system can stay fast and robust, while the batch system takes longer but does a deeper analysis of the data. And it's also, I think, effective to be able to implement different algorithmic choices in the batch layer compared to the online system, so that you're able to enjoy the benefit of different types of algorithms coming together on the same problem. Clustering is another classic example of how to implement an unsupervised observer that is able to cluster documents together into attacks and be able to surface them out for a training subsystem to be able to incorporate that into the next round or batch of training. So to conclude my talk today, the takeaway is that traditional machine learning systems are challenged in a variety of ways when an active adversary is present. And by following a few fairly simple design principles, engineers and system implementers can successfully adapt their ML systems to deal with tactics employed by an adversary. And it gives us hope that these design ideas can help us build robust systems that, while under attack, are still able to counter the attack in a reasonably short amount of time and let those systems continue to operate correctly. Thank you.
All right, great, Vish. I got one quick question for you here. Boto asks, what would an analyst typically be interacting with in near real-time application of these techniques? So I guess, can you distinguish between what's being done sort of batch process and what's being done real time? Is there someone sitting there, knocking off bad evildoers as they show up, or is this more of a batch-based longer-term thing?
It's typically a batch-based longer-term thing. You never want to put a human in the loop of an online system. What you do have to remember to do, though, is review the results of the online system by clustering the results together in a meaningful manner. So it's important to develop a set of tools for an analyst to, behind the scenes, for example, do a daily review and ensure that the system has not deviated significantly from what was expected, and to detect these early signs of an attack and to be able to incorporate that into the right training data sets.
Great. So thank you so much for that look at this stuff. I think what's interesting in the arc that we looked at today is we started with some of the sort of social problems and big consequences, looked at some of the more sublime and ridiculous ways that people can tweak things, looked at some of the systems that are out there at a large scale to prevent this kind of fraud, and then looked very specifically at the algorithms and the underlying tools that people are putting into practice with a bunch of patterns. So it's been a good arc from the ridiculous to the sublime to the practical, and I want to thank you for wrapping that up for us. And thank you very much to all of you who are on the phone. Yasmina, I think you have a few closing remarks.
Yes, thank you very much, Alistair, for organizing today's online conference, and a very big thank you to all of our presenters. And we'd also like to thank all of our attendees. And folks, a big thank you to Microsoft for sponsoring today's online conference, and to let you all know that Microsoft's Big Data solution enables organizations to unlock actionable insights from structured, unstructured, and streaming data. You can now deploy Hadoop with HD Insight Service in the cloud with the simplicity and manageability of Windows Azure. Glean new insights from all your data with familiar tools such as Excel and SharePoint using our Hive ODBC drivers and add-ins. Enrich your data by combining with the world's data through Windows Azure Marketplace. You can learn more at www.microsoft.com/bigdata. Also, I'd like to let you know, folks, we did push out some information in your group chat. So if you didn't open it now. Get the information. It's about our upcoming Strata conference. February 26th to the 28th in Santa Clara, California. You can still save 20% on your registration. So we hope to see you there. Again, thank you, Alistair. Thank you, everyone. This will conclude our online conference. Goodbye, everybody.